In the summer of 1945, the United States Army manufactured 370,000 Purple Hearts. Not over the course of the war, in a single production run, for a single operation against a single enemy. One medal for every American soldier expected to come home from that operation wounded, or not come home at all. The stockpile sat in government warehouses. Those Purple Hearts were still being awarded to American soldiers wounded in Korea and Vietnam and the Gulf War and Iraq and Afghanistan. 75 years of American warfare and the supply made for one invasion of one archipelago in 1945 had still not been exhausted. What operation required 370,000 casualty medals? What did the United States military believe was coming? And why didn't it? The answer is not a single battle. It is a decision, one of the most consequential in the history of warfare. And to understand why America made it, you have to understand what they believed they were choosing between. By the summer of 1945, Japan was militarily ruined. Its navy barely existed. Its best pilots were dead. Its armies were scattered and isolated across an empire that had already collapsed. The American naval blockade had stopped most shipping, creating crippling shortages of food and oil. American bombing raids had leveled most major Japanese cities. 200,000 dead from conventional bombing. 473,000 more wounded. A single firebombing raid on Tokyo in March killed more than 80,000 people in one night. And still Japan fought on. Its government did not negotiate. Its military did not break. Its people did not revolt. And the paradox was plain. A nation on the edge of ruin, choosing ruin over surrender. For American military planners staring at their maps in Washington, the question was not whether Japan was losing. The question was what it would take to make them stop. The Pacific War had been built island by island on a logic of escalating cost. At Iwo Jima, an island less than 8 square miles, 6,800 Americans died and 19,000 were wounded. At Okinawa, 350 miles south of Japan's home islands, 12,500 Americans were killed and 49,000 more wounded. The casualty rate was 35%. 1 in 3 Americans who set foot on that island came off it as a casualty. Japan was the only destination left. On the afternoon of June 18, 1945, Harry Truman convened a meeting in the White House Cabinet Room. Maps of Kyushu were pinned to the walls. The Joint Chiefs were present. Secretary of War Henry Stimson was present. The afternoon light fell through tall windows onto men who understood exactly what they were about to decide. At stake was whether to press forward with the most ambitious amphibious operation in history or to find some other way to end a war that was grinding toward its 4th year. The operation had a name, Operation Downfall. 2 phases. Phase 1, Operation Olympic, targeted the southern third of Kyushu, Japan's southernmost main island, with November 1st, 1945 set as X-Day. Phase 2, Operation Coronet, was the assault on the Kanto Plain near Tokyo, planned for the spring of 1946. If executed, downfall would be larger than Normandy. It would require 1.7 million American troops, 42 aircraft carriers, 24 battleships, and 400 destroyers. Truman was afraid it would look like, in his own words, an Okinawa from one end of Japan to the other. The casualty estimates presented at that meeting ranged from 31,000 to well over 200,000 American dead. And those were the conservative figures. A study prepared by physicist William Shockley projected up to 4 million American casualties and 10 million Japanese dead. Herbert Hoover, asked by Truman to prepare post-war planning, estimated up to 1 million Americans killed and wounded. The numbers varied because the uncertainty was genuine. The estimates depended on assumptions about Japanese resistance that were changing faster than the estimates could be updated. Truman approved the planning. He ordered the troop transfers from Europe. The door to invasion swung open. What no one in that cabinet room yet fully understood was what was waiting on the other side. Japan had been watching. Its military intelligence had worked through the same geography American planners had studied and arrived at the same conclusions. The invasion, when it came, would have to come through Kyushu. The terrain made any other approach nearly impossible, and so Japan did something the Germans never managed before Normandy. Japan predicted the exact beaches: Miyazaki, Ariake Bay, the Satsuma Peninsula, the same 3 locations where American divisions were planned to land. Japan calculated the timing as well: the end of the typhoon season, the first days of November. Their prediction and the American plan aligned so closely that the documents laid side by side were nearly interchangeable. They were not waiting to be surprised. They were waiting to be ready. What the Americans were walking into had a name: Operation Ketsu Go. Its logic was not to win. Japan's military leadership had moved beyond the concept of victory. The objective of Ketsu Go was to kill enough Americans to break the will of the American public and force a negotiated settlement rather than unconditional surrender. The strategic center of gravity in Japanese planning was not territory. It was American willingness to keep paying. In the spring of 1945, one Japanese Army division defended Kyushu. By midsummer, ultra-code-breaking intercepts began tracking a buildup that alarmed every planner who saw the numbers. 6 divisions, then 10. By late summer, American intelligence estimated 680,000 defenders on the island. The actual number, invisible to American planners, was over 900,000. The Japanese were adding divisions faster than the intelligence could record them. The kamikaze arsenal grew with the same momentum. In May, estimates counted 3,391 aircraft available for suicide attacks. In June, 4,862. In August, 5,911. The Navy's estimate, counting all available aircraft including trainers, reached 10,290. By the time the war ended, Japan possessed 12,700 aircraft in the home islands, roughly half of them configured as kamikazes. At Okinawa, 2,000 kamikazes had been deployed. They sank 20 American vessels and damaged 217 more. At Kyushu, the terrain would allow attack runs at low altitude, shielded from ships' radar by the coastline. This time, the pilots had new orders: target the transports, not the warships, not the carriers and destroyers, the ships carrying the men. One staff study estimated that kamikazes could destroy between 1/3 and 1/2 of the invasion force before it reached the beaches. Japanese planners projected they would sink more than 400 ships. The naval forces waiting offshore were not only aircraft, roughly 100 Koryu midget submarines, 200 smaller Kairyu submarines, 1,000 Kaiten torpedoes, at least 800 Shinyo high-speed suicide boats, and just beneath the surface near the landing beaches, 4,000 Fukuryu suicide frogmen, each armed with a lunge mine on a long pole, waiting to ram the hulls of Allied landing craft. On land, 28 million civilians had been organized into the Volunteer Fighting Corps. Men from 15 to 60, women from 17 to 40. Many had been trained with bamboo spears, grenades, and improvised explosives. The government had launched a propaganda campaign whose title required no translation: The Glorious Death of 100 Million. And in captured planning documents, stated with the bluntness of a military directive, all Allied prisoners of war were to be executed upon invasion. Approximately 100,000 men. This is what was waiting. American planners knew the situation was bad. They did not yet know how precisely it had been arranged for them. Harry Truman had 4 options, and by the summer of 1945, time was making each one smaller. The first was continued conventional bombing, which was already burning Japan's cities to ash without breaking its leadership. The second was blockade, which was starving the country and might, given months or years, force a surrender, but would also starve millions of Japanese civilians and keep American troops in the Pacific indefinitely. The third was a ground invasion, and the maps were on the walls. The fourth option was a weapon whose existence Truman had only learned about 83 days earlier. In May, Truman formed the Interim Committee, a group of civilian leaders and scientists empowered to advise him on the atomic bomb. The committee was chaired by Stimson, advised by J. Robert Oppenheimer and the scientific panel. It met, it deliberated, and it heard from the dissenters. A group of scientists led by Leo Szilard at the University of Chicago, who urged that the bomb be demonstrated on a deserted island before an international audience, giving Japan a chance to witness the weapon's power without a city burning beneath it. The committee rejected the demonstration for 3 reasons. First, what if the bomb failed to detonate? An American superweapon that misfired would harden Japanese resolve rather than shatter it. Second, there were only 2 bombs. Using one on an empty island expended half the country's entire atomic arsenal on a piece of ocean. Third, and this reason would only become clear in the weeks to come, there was genuine doubt that even a spectacular demonstration would move Japan's military leadership. That doubt would be vindicated, but not in the way anyone hoped. On June 21st, the Interim Committee delivered its recommendation. We can propose no technical demonstration likely to bring an end to the war. We can see no acceptable alternative to direct military use. The bomb, if used, should be used without warning on a target combining military significance with surrounding structures whose destruction would demonstrate the weapon's scale. 4 cities were placed on the target list. Stimson personally removed a 5th, Kyoto. He had visited the ancient capital. He would not see it burned. Hiroshima made the list. So did Nagasaki. On July 16th, in the desert of New Mexico, the bomb was tested. Truman was at Potsdam when the news reached him. In his diary, he called it the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. He wrote that it may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah and his fabulous ark. The man who would publicly claim he never lost sleep over this decision put those words in his private journal and told no one. He did tell Stalin something at Potsdam. He approached the Soviet leader and mentioned carefully that the United States had a new weapon of unusual destructive force, a controlled disclosure, a diplomatic signal. Stalin listened. He showed no visible reaction, not because he was unimpressed, but because the information was not new. Soviet intelligence had already penetrated the Manhattan Project. Stalin had known about the bomb for years. The great diplomatic moment of the summer of 1945 was a conversation between two men who both knew more than they were saying, and only one of them knew that. On July 26th, the Allied leaders issued the Potsdam Declaration, an ultimatum demanding Japan's unconditional surrender, warning of prompt and utter destruction. The declaration did not mention the atomic bomb. Outside the Allied command, the weapon's existence was classified. The phrase prompt and utter destruction was the warning. But without the word atomic, it was a warning Japan could not decode. They had no way of knowing what was behind it. Japan's Prime Minister Suzuki responded with a word, mokusatsu. It may mean no comment. It may mean treat with silent contempt. The ambiguity was real. Suzuki may have intended it as a holding position while Japan continued to seek Soviet mediation, not as a formal rejection. What the Americans heard, through the imprecision of translation and the static of war, was refusal. The door closed. On August 6, 1945, in the pre-dawn darkness of Tinian Island, a tropical airstrip 1,500 miles south of Japan, 12 men boarded a B-29 named the Enola Gay. The bomb was already in the aircraft's belly. The runway stretched into blackness. The plane took off at 2:45 in the morning and turned north, climbing through the Pacific night. At 8:15 a.m. over Hiroshima, on a clear summer morning, with the Ota River Delta spread below in blue and silver, Little Boy was released. In the first minutes, 80,000 dead. The pillar of smoke climbed to 40,000 feet. Tens of thousands more would die in the weeks that followed from radiation and burns. Tokyo received word of a devastating event in Hiroshima. The Imperial Army declared it would only concede the weapon's nature after an investigation. And the Supreme War Council, the six-man body holding the legal power to end the war, did not convene. Not that day, not the next. 3 full days passed after the most destructive single strike in human history before Japan's leadership formally met to discuss it. Admiral Somu Toyoda, one of the 3 military hawks on the council, argued that the United States could not possibly possess more than a handful of such weapons. He would hold to this position even as the evidence mounted. The scientists who had proposed a demonstration on an uninhabited island had assumed that a display of the bomb's power would break Japan's military leadership. The real bomb on a real city with 80,000 dead had produced 3 days of institutional silence and a demand for further investigation. The assumption had its answer. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, 2 days after Hiroshima, hours before the second bomb. With it went the last avenue Japan's peace faction had been counting on, Moscow as a diplomatic intermediary. That channel did not close slowly. It was gone overnight. On August 9th, Soviet forces crossed into Manchuria. Within hours, a second aircraft reached Nagasaki. In the first minute after Fat Man detonated, 39,000 people were killed. 25,000 more were wounded. Suzuki, who had just come from a meeting with Hirohito, told the Supreme Council that morning that it was impossible to continue the war. The council was deadlocked. On one side, General Korochika Anami, General Yoshijiro Umezu, Admiral Soimu Toyoda. On the other, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, Naval Minister Mitsumasa Yonai, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo. 3 against 3. In the Japanese constitutional structure, a cabinet could govern only with unanimous consent. The army could veto any decision simply by having its minister resign, collapsing the government. Anami held this power and intended to use it. Even now, after Hiroshima, after Nagasaki, after Soviet entry, he argued for the defense of the home islands. He was not a fanatic in any simple sense. He was a man so completely enclosed within the logic of military obligation and institutional honor that no other move was available to him. The system had made his position inevitable. 2 atomic bombs had not unmade it. The deadlock was constitutional. No vote could break it. No argument could break it. There was one person alive who could. Shortly before midnight on August 9th, Prime Minister Suzuki requested something that had never happened in the history of the Supreme War Council, an imperial conference. He asked the emperor to decide. The men gathered in the bomb shelter beneath the imperial palace. It was past midnight. They were exhausted, in formal dress, in the underground dim. The argument had been made and remade, and the lines had not moved. Then Suzuki told Hirohito that consensus was impossible and asked him to speak. Hirohito spoke. He endorsed the position of the peace faction, acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration on one condition: the imperial institution must be preserved. His voice in that shelter ended the stalemate that the destruction of 2 cities could not. What followed was the longest night of the war. The surrender announcement was prepared. A recording was made. It was placed in a safe in the Imperial Household Ministry. And through that night, a group of young army officers moved through the palace grounds with weapons. They were looking for the recording. They intended to destroy it, to prevent it from being broadcast, to force the war to continue by eliminating the evidence that the emperor had spoken. Others left the palace with a different purpose, moving through the darkened streets of Tokyo toward the homes of the men who had argued for peace. Assassination orders had been issued against members of the council. The coup failed. The assassinations failed. The recording survived. At noon on August 15, 1945, the Japanese people heard the voice of their emperor for the first time. He spoke in archaic court Japanese, formal, distant, a dialect many of his subjects struggled to understand. He explained that Japan had accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. He did not use the word surrender. He referred to a new and most cruel bomb. He gave his reasons: lost faith in the defensive strategy, the devastation of the bombing, and what he called the domestic situation, the growing fear of internal revolt that no military victory could any longer forestall. His voice ended. The war was over, except that it was not yet. In China and in commands across the southern area, Japanese officers declared they would not comply. Between a quarter and a third of all Japanese servicemen were under commanders who initially refused the emperor's order. It took Hirohito's personal emissaries traveling physically to those commands before the surrender held everywhere. The formal ceremony took place on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, on a brilliant morning with the harbor flat and still. MacArthur stood at the microphone, his corncob pipe set aside. The Japanese delegation ascended from a motorboat, climbed the ladder, signed. American aircraft roared overhead. What followed has not finished being argued about. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded, after exhaustive review of the evidence, that Japan would likely have surrendered before November 1st, 1945, even without the atomic bombs or an invasion. The revisionist school of historians, beginning with Gar Alperovitz in the 1960s, built on this finding, arguing that Japan was already collapsing, that the bombs were unnecessary, that other motives, including the management of post-war Soviet power, shaped the decision. The counter-evidence has to be placed alongside it. The Supreme War Council was deadlocked after 2 atomic bombs. A coup was attempted the night before the announcement. Overseas commands refused the order. It required the emperor's personal, unprecedented intervention to break a stalemate that the destruction of 2 cities had not broken. If a war ends this narrowly, this contingently, this close to failing even after the bombs, then the question of whether any gentler shock would have ended it cleanly is not one the evidence resolves. 2 ironies remain in the record. The first, Kyoto survives. Stimson removes it from the target list personally, on the grounds that destroying Japan's ancient cultural capital would generate hostility that could push post-war Japan toward the Soviet Union. One man's attachment to a civilization he visited as a younger man saves a city. The calculus that governs everything else in this story yields for one moment to something else entirely. The second, the condition Japan needed in order to end the war, the preservation of the emperor's position, is ultimately granted by the Allies. Hirohito remains. Joseph Grew, who had served as American ambassador to Japan, had brought exactly this proposal to Truman in May 1945. General MacArthur had agreed that an offer protecting the emperor might have secured surrender months earlier. Herbert Hoover believed Japan might have negotiated as early as February. What is finally conceded after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, after Soviet entry, after the coup and the Midnight Conference and the emissaries and the ceremony on the Missouri, is what might have been offered in the spring before any of it. History does not confirm what would have happened if it had been. The deadlock in Japan was real. The institutional forces resisting surrender were real. Whether modified terms would have broken them in time is a question the record cannot answer cleanly. Henry Stimson called what was chosen our least abhorrent choice. That phrase has lasted because it is honest about what it is not claiming. It is not claiming the choice was good. It is not claiming the alternatives were worse. It is claiming only that the men who made it, living inside the uncertainty of that summer, with the maps on the walls and the casualty estimates in their hands and the clock running, could not find anything they were willing to call better. 370,000 Purple Hearts, made in 1945 for men in an invasion that never came, still being placed on the chests of soldiers wounded in wars whose names the men who manufactured them could not have imagined. Whether that stockpile is the legacy of the atomic bomb, or of the invasion it replaced, or of the war that made both of them necessary, that is a question history has been answering for 80 years and has not finished answering.